Hello, good morning and welcome to this webinar presentation brought to you by Perpetual and Matthews Folbigg lawyers on the topic of free-range families meet the Silverliners. Please don't worry, we'll find out in due course what free-range families are and what Silverliners are, and a great deal many other things. But for now, my name is Jeff Brown. I'm the chairman at Matthews Folbigg Lawyers, a 40-lawyer firm located right in the middle of the explosion in economic growth in Western Sydney. It's my great delight to introduce our speakers today. We'll be hearing firstly from Gary Lambert from Perpetual and then from Mimi Sue, one of our incredibly talented lawyers at Matthews Folbigg. But firstly, Gary. Gary is a market research professional with more than 35 years' experience. Prior to working at Perpetual, Gary was with one of the largest market research companies in the world, TNS, for 20 years, followed by 6 years at Macquarie. He's worked at Perpetual Corporate Trust for 6 years as a client insights manager. His job title should probably tell you a little bit about Perpetual and its focus on clients. But for now, can I hand over to Gary, who is going to introduce some of these fascinating subjects to us.
Thank you, Jeff. That was terrific. So, yes, I've been doing this for a long time, but it's always fascinating. One of the beautiful things about being the survey guy, as they call me, is finding out what makes Australians tick. And I take the opportunity every year to do a very large study amongst Australians. And let me just tell you a little bit about that. I'm calling it the What Do You Care About project. And what it does is it allows us to look at what Australians care about. We ask 3,000 Australians to respond to the survey each year. And we tailor the survey each year to what seems relevant and pertinent to the times. And of course, this year with COVID, we focused on what I'm calling the personal edition of people spending a lot of time on their own. And a lot of time at home, so some of the issues surrounding that. Last year it was the families. And one of the beautiful things about doing this study and having such a large group of Australians to analyse is you can go looking for fascinating and interesting groups in the population, unique groups of people that may be aspirational. There's every chance that people in the audience today will be in one or more of the groups that I'm going to talk to you about, the free-range families and the Silverliners. So let's have a look first at how we define each of those groups. So the free-range families we discovered last year, they are people who feel happy and positive about their family. They describe their relationship with their family as close and caring. They don't have disagreements with their family about money, which is obviously a good thing, and they prioritise family over long life and excitement. So we'll learn a lot about that group today. They're quite different from the Silverliners. This year we felt that being the COVID year, obviously people looking to the future, we wanted to understand people who are optimistic about the future and have coped well throughout the year. So the Silverliners are people who feel optimistic about life right now. They're relaxed, spending time on their own. They face challenges with a positive mindset. They're comfortable discussing the future with their family, their own future and the future more generally. They describe their mental health as good, great or fantastic, and they have plans for the future and take action of them. So that probably gives you a bit of an idea initially about whether you might be in one or both of those groups. But let's look at the free-range families specifically. And I love these chooks. Aren't they a beautiful thing? So here's the demographic profile. And when we look at a demographic profile, we're looking at skews in the population. So free-range family people in that category are more likely to be readers. They're people that like reading books. Many of them are in Queensland, so they're more highly represented in Queensland. They work in retail, and I've found that fascinating. They're quite different from the Silverliners in that respect. They save money, they have kids, they own their own home, and there's definitely a strong leaning towards women, so there are more women in the free-range family group than there are men. So what do they enjoy doing with their family? Well, there's three things that really stood out where the free-range families were vastly different from the rest of the Australian population. That is in their love for celebrating events, for talking together and for eating meals. Now have a look at those percentages. They're big, big differences. Talking together, for example, 85% of free-range families enjoy talking to their family. talking together with their family, compared to only 56% in the general population. Big, big differences. What sort of life do free-range families want for their kids? And in this case, we gave people three choices, and we're having a look here at what their choices were. The first thing was the choice between choosing their own path over a safe or exciting life. They're absolutely into having their kids choose their own path. A healthy life over wealth or wisdom. Happiness over a long life and money, and being decent human beings over being married or financially independent. So we get a sense already that they're free and they like their family to feel free. So their attitude to providing for their children financially is not surprisingly that they want their kids to be financially independent, 86% versus 77% of the general population. And we said to them, well, look, what things are you prepared to do for your family, for your kids in particular? And there was a strong orientation to being willing to pay for their wedding. And even though they'd like their kids to be free, they're just as willing, in fact, more willing than the average Australian to allow their kids to stay at home rent-free. So they're open to caring and open to sharing. When it comes to wills, and we'll hear more about this a little bit later, the free-range family people are far more likely to have a will than the rest of Australians. But they're not concerned about what their kids will do with their will. So there's that freedom aspect again. But they've got that discipline that means that they go into life thinking that a will is a really good thing. What they'd like their kids to do with a will is use it wisely, enjoy it, but whatever makes sense. So giving them the freedom to choose for themselves. On the flip side, they've also far more likely to have inherited. So they've had a good opportunity to know what inheritance is like on the other side, and it's probably encouraging them to have wills for their family as well. They're far more likely to feel grateful about whatever they inherited, and they're far more likely to have shared their will or their inheritance with their family. They're very open, very caring, and very sharing. So, what advice would free-range families like to give to their parents? And we'll look at the flip side of advice they'd like to give to their kids in a minute. Well, they're free in terms of their parents as well. They're saying, look, you worry about yourself, go out and have a good time, travel the world, well, maybe not this year. Spend up and enjoy life, stay active and social, and look after your health. Looks like great advice, but it's all about feeling that their parents are going to have as good a time as possible. They're also sensible with money. When it comes to asking them whether they agree or disagree with these sort of statements, they say, absolutely you should live within your means, 57% versus 43%, again, a big difference, and never spend what you don't have. So I guess they don't get as stressed about money because they're always in control of what they're spending their money on. And they also believe in good quality advice. So 22% have a financial advisor versus 18% in the general population. So they're not only free in their thinking about what they can do with life, what their family should be doing with life, but they value and recognise what a great expert can deliver, whether it's a lawyer, whether it's a financial advisor. It's just that respect for expertise. They're great talkers, this group of people. They're comfortable talking with their family about absolutely anything. And again, big differences in the free-range family group compared to the rest of the population. So they'll talk about health, the future. Look at that, 82% versus 53% in the general population. They'll talk about money, they'll talk about relationships, and they'll talk about death. So having those conversations about their intentions with their will and their inheritance become very, very easy for this group of people, and it helps the family a lot as well. So that's the free-range families. Well, the Silverliners were a different case this year. Well, we certainly went looking for a group of people that were optimistic in the face of everything we've all been through. So let's have a look at this group and see how they differ. First of all, the demographic profile. Well, the difference here is they're more likely to be men than women, as we found with the free-range families. They're the same in the sense that they've got kids. The crow there means South Australia, so they're more highly represented in South Australia than in other states, and they're about 40 years old, and that was fascinating to us as well. They tend to be working full-time, and they're often in director positions, so as opposed to the retail sort of focus we found with the free-range families. Now, here's an interesting statistic. They are far more likely than the general population to have parents who were born in India. the things you find out. I'm not quite sure what to make about that, but it was interesting. And of course, just like the free-range families, they own their own home as well. So when they're on their own, what are they doing? Well, they're more likely to do things like exercise, have hobbies, chores, doing things for the family. They're more likely to be thinking about their family, but they're thinking about the future as well. And that's interesting because not everybody's been doing that this year. We've been, a lot of us have been introspective, and some of us have worried more about the future than others. But at the same time, they're thinking about, well, how do I get ahead financially? How do I plan for that future, both in terms of what I'd like to do, but in terms of my capability, in terms of achieving the things I'd like to achieve. They're interesting too from the point of view of feeling calm, feeling contentment and feeling happiness. So they're happy in their own skin and they don't mind being on their own. But the fact of the matter is they spend less time on their own than the average Australian. So 10% say they spend most of their time on their own compared to 17% of the Australian population. They do have worries too. It's not that everybody has worries to one extent or another. They're less likely though to worry about loneliness, lack of energy, physical and mental health. So we saw before they're more likely to exercise, and that exercise does them a lot of good, and it's something they don't have to worry about quite as much. But they do worry about the health of their family, so their worries are more about others than they are about themselves. They're worried about climate change and they're worried about racist behaviour and kids. So they've got a very worldly view and they're concerned about the community and they're concerned about social issues. They get comfort from exercise, from walking, talking, thinking and reading. So they're active in many, many ways. You'll note though that watching TV is not one of those things, and that's something they're less likely to do. They've got some personal qualities that stand out compared to the rest of the population. They're more likely to be open-minded, just like the free-range families. They're patient, they're tolerant, they're motivated, and they've got an inner strength. And the qualities they've drawn on during COVID have been their caring, their discipline, their cheerfulness, their patience, and their hope. So they've really been actively thinking about the world, about what they're doing, about what their future's likely to be, and made the most of this time where things have changed so much. They're interesting when it comes to making decisions as well, because sometimes people delay big decisions, and in the case of Silverliners, they're more likely to delay big decisions when there's no urgency. Why force yourself into a decision when you can take your time to think about it? And in the meantime, why not go and get some great professional advice and recognise when you're not well placed to make a decision that somebody else can help you with that decision a whole lot better. They're planners. In the same way that free-range families are planners as well, they're more likely to plan for things like holidays, achieving personal goals, growing wealth, looking after their health and retirement. So they're thinking about a lot of things and they're thinking about the long term. They're more likely to also achieve their plans because they discuss those plans with their partner and they make decisions that will help them achieve their plans. They go out and do stuff and they make progress every day and every week. Their financial orientation is quite different from the average Australian. They're sensible, they're good with money, just as the free-range families were as well. They're very confident managing their finances, and they share responsibility for their financial situation with their partner and their family. They tend to be investors. They're people who say nothing will stop me from getting ahead financially. They love using financial advisors, but at the same time, they're charitable. Their health orientation, they choose healthy and fresh ingredients for their dinner. They actually believe salad is a comfort food. Can you believe that? There are people out there that believe that. In fact, men told us they're more likely to tell us they think salad is a comfort food than women, but I'm not sure if they were really being serious. They believe being active, eating well and getting sunshine are major contributors to physical health, and they believe eating well, relaxing, thinking, talking and taking holidays are major contributors to mental health. Now there's an invitation for you. There's a whole bunch of things that are quite fun to do and ultimately have a good impact on how you feel about life. They're good talkers, and this is probably the defining feature for both free-range families and Silverliners. They're comfortable talking about the future, world events, relationships, even politics, death, and again, that opportunity to talk about their intentions in the future, education, pretty much anything. So, if we're summing it up, here's two groups of Australians, and I might add, and I didn't tell you at the beginning, that in each case, respectively, there are about 7% of the Australian population. So about 1 in 14 people qualifies for one or the other, and a very small number qualify for both. So on the free-range family side, they're more likely to be sharing. They're defined by being sharing. They give freedom of choice, and they love freedom of choice for themselves, and they're very concerned about the world they leave behind. The Silverliners, they've got discipline. They've spent this last 12 months planning for the future and doing things to help them take the world in the coming years at a pace when it comes around. They've got common sense and they've got a lot of respect for expertise. And in common, these two groups have both tolerance and love a good conversation. So, if you want to be one of those, if you aspire to be one of those, if you're not one of these groups already, start talking and you never know what could happen. So thanks very much for listening. I'm going to hand over to Mimi now, who's going to talk to us about some other issues related to what I've just been talking about.
Thanks very much, Gary. Before we hear from Mimi, I just wanted to thank you again for a fascinating presentation. As I suspected, it was a combination of things that confirmed some of my own thoughts and some real surprises. I think that statistic about males seeing salad as a comfort food might need a recount, though. I still don't believe it. Mimi, I'm very honoured and privileged to introduce as she works with me at Folbigg Lawyers. Mimi is one of our specialists in estate planning. She works on deceased estate matters and also tax-related issues. She has extensive experience in all aspects of estate planning, including preparing testamentary trust wills and advising on various asset structures such as family trusts, special disability trusts and superannuation funds. She's acted for a wide range of individuals, including notable high net worth individuals and family groups in respect to obtaining grants of probate, dealing with concerned estate matters and capacity issues. It's her background in taxation from a Big Four accounting firm and having completed her Master of Laws specialising in taxation that means that she can provide tax-conscious legal advice, which is becoming increasingly a necessity given the complexity of family group structures and asset holdings. Mimi is going to be looking specifically at how the process of thinking through and then developing a will helps to flesh out some of those issues that Gary has just raised. Over to you, Mimi.
Thanks, Jeff, for that great introduction. So my name is Mimi Sue. I'm a solicitor that works at Folbigg Lawyers. I specialise in wills and estate planning. So following on from Gary's presentation, so what does wills and estate planning have to do with if you're a member of the free-range families or the Silverliners group? Well, first of all, from Gary's presentation, we know that if you're a person that fits within the free-range families category, you're somebody that's happy, you're happy with your family, you have a good relationship with your family during your lifetime. So it makes sense that when you pass away, you should have a will that you should hope would ensure harmony between your family members, what we're trying to do in the estate planning world is to minimise any friction or disputes that could arise. Similarly, with the same line of thought, with Silverliner families, what's important to them is planning for the future and making sure that their families are as wherever possible as financially secure as possible. So once again, this leads into my presentation as to why it's important to have a will, and that is obviously the starting point. You've seen from the earlier statistics that more than half of the Australian population don't have wills. So the starting point is to have a will because the will is important in terms of documenting the will maker's intentions as to what they would like to do with their estate and how they would like their assets to be distributed. It is becoming increasingly more important now in society to have a will because families generally are becoming wealthier. And for the people that fall within either a free-range family or you're a Silverliner, you heard that they generally hold property. So as a starting point, you have a property, you should have a will. Because of the fact that estates are bigger, there are now more disputes arising in this area because if there's more more assets around, it's more worthwhile to have a dispute sometimes. Families are also more complicated now. The nuclear family where you have a mum and dad and 2 kids, and that's the first marriage for those 2 people. There's not children floating around from other relationships, is no longer the norm. So when you have it's more of a blended family context. It's not that nucleus family. It's more the opportunities for disputes to arise following your death is on the rise. So what in my line of work, when we talk about wills and estate planning, what we're trying to achieve for our clients is constructing an estate plan or a will which for them will minimise any potential for disputes down the track when they pass away. So with the drafting of a will, we like to, wherever possible, keep things simple and as straightforward as possible, because there is a lot of beauty in being able to keep things simple. As a starting point, though, even something as simple as who you would like to choose as executor, although it's a simple concept, can cause friction within the family members. So, for instance, if you have 2 kids, a lot of people will come in to see me and say, my preference is to have only one of the children because the 2 of them don't get along, or I could see that the brother would be exerting a lot of control or influence over the sister. So just this is a starting point, having that important discussion about who should be the executive of the will is an important consideration. And following on from that, your will only takes effect when you've passed away. Other documents that you should think about as part of the estate planning process is a document called a power of attorney, which determines who you would like to nominate somebody during your lifetime to make financial decisions for you if you become incapable. And obviously there's a bit of thought process that goes into who's the best person in your family for you to nominate as your attorney. And once again, when we look at it holistically, we're talking about, when we have these conversations with clients, where our starting point is to say who is the best pick for you, and also to try to minimise any disputes or friction that could occur between your children because of the choices that you've made. The second point about that is that we do like to try to keep the will as simple as possible. So, for instance, wherever possible, we look at everything in your estate and we call it the residue, and we say it's equally between the kids, or we figure out a percentage split between those residue assets, as opposed to having specific gifting of properties or shares or cash. And that just assists with down the track when you've passed away and we need to administer your estate. And if you've sold or bought new shares, different houses, it takes away some of those complications that can arise. So from a advice perspective, we always try to not recommend specific gifting, but that's, once again, the solution for that really needs to be tailored to the needs of the client. And obviously that's why it is important to seek specialist advice in this area. The third point, though, I'll finish with in this, what are the starting things to consider when you're doing a will is, common question that comes up is a discussion around should I have equal distribution or unequal distribution, more in the context of children. Naturally, for a lot of people, if you've got 2 kids, it goes without saying it should be an equal distribution between those 2 kids. If it's 3 kids, it's equal distribution between those 3 kids. That, a lot of the times, is usually not controversial and doesn't cause problems down the track between your children should you pass away. Equally, on the other flip side of that, though, there is some very good reasons why a discussion sometimes is had between the parents or the will makers as to why there should be unequal distribution between the kids. Because, for instance, maybe if there's 2 children, one of them is actually particularly wealthy in their own right, and maybe the other sibling actually is not wealthy and could also suffer from a disability. So that those types of family contexts, it's just important to have the conversation with us as the professional advisor as to what they feel is the objectives of what they want to achieve with their children. And we also encourage, wherever possible, to bring the children in on the conversation early, because with families, obviously, as you know, if you're happy with your family, you all get along now, the will that you want to leave following your death is one in which you want to minimise any disruption to that harmonious family. So it's important wherever possible to bring them into that conversation. Whether it's equal distribution or unequal distribution, there's really no right or wrong answer to that. It really does depend on the family circumstances and the relationships that you have with those children and the children between themselves as well. So just following on from that, I then move on to some of the things that in the world of estate planning wills that can get a bit more complicated. What we aim to do is always to try to achieve the best will for your beneficiaries, which is each will look different because obviously it would depend on what your beneficiaries look like. I've categorised different types of beneficiaries. So the first one there I've referred to is a vulnerable beneficiary. And by this I mean you could have a person that you want to inherit from your estate, be it a child who either is a bit of a spendthrift or potentially they're easily influenced by people that you think are a bad influence on them, or they might have a disability, so it should be the case that they would never be in a position to manage their own finances or the inheritance that you would leave them. So in those circumstances, we would have a discussion with you as to what's the best type of structure and how you should leave your estate or give the inheritance to that person who's vulnerable. The second category of a beneficiary is that they could actually be reluctant. In this context, I'm referring to people who, for instance, now with an ageing population, a lot of people live well into their 90s. That's not unusual now. They live well into their 90s, so by the time they actually pass away, their children would be maybe in the 60 plus category. They might actually, the child who's in the 60 plus category might actually be on the full aged pension, or they could be on a partial pension. And the context that I've seen, but in instances when they've come to see me, it's already too late. When the parent has passed away, the one that's in the 90s, and the child's about to receive the inheritance under the will, they actually tell me they don't want it because as a result of receiving the inheritance, it pushes them over the Centrelink asset test limits. So as a result, they're a real reluctant beneficiary. But once they've been left that gift under the will, even if they say they don't want it, you can't get around the Centrelink asset rules. So with that, it's really, once again, for the will maker or the parent to have the conversation with the advisor in this area, consider what the circumstances of the children in their family is, and try to craft a will that would best suit your family circumstances. The third type of, the point there I talk about is that if the beneficiary has a disability or there's other issues as well, maybe the beneficiary shouldn't be the child directly, or it shouldn't be that person directly. The estate or part of the estate should actually be left to a trust as the beneficiary. There are some merits in pursuing that type of will. For instance, if the estate is quite a sizable amount, then for tax planning opportunities, there are instances where it would make more sense to place the estate assets into a trust as opposed to directly to a beneficiary. I'll just then move on to circumstances where there's been complications that arise in the estate that are quite difficult to deal with. As much as, it sounds wonderful if you fulfill the statistics of being a free-range family or a Silverliner. We know that that's only 7% of the population in either. So there's lots of other families out there that are not happy, or are not, they don't have great relationships with their kids, or they don't talk to their kids. There are instances where we're dealing with a client where they do have an estrangement with a child or children. So what do they do about that in the context of a will? They come in to see us, and the will maker might have very clear intentions as to they want to exclude that specific child because of past behaviour or the sheer lack of contact over decades. So it's important that we have that conversation with them and then provide advice around that, because certainly they are within their legal rights to do the will as they want, because that's the freedom that a will maker has. But there are also, on the flip side of that, implications down the track when the person does pass away and the will ends up being contested. So all this kind of stuff is all very general that I'm talking to you about, because with each family and each individual, it's very much dependent on their circumstances, what type of specialist advice we can provide to them to deal with these different type of scenarios. The second example I've got there of what can lead to more complications in the estate planning world is I'm talking about blended families. So this is not to say that blended families are not happy families. Lots of blended families are happy, but I'm talking about by blended families, I mean families where either the husband and the wife or the couple have previously been married and they have adult children from that first relationship. They've now married. It's a second relationship. They might not have children together. In some instances, they have younger children together. So these are the types of families that I'm talking about when I refer to blended families. Now, it's not to say that they're not happy. It's just that because when there are more people involved in your family and your extended family, there's more people that on your passing will have conflicting interests as to, they think they should have gotten this and somebody else shouldn't have gotten as much as, as the other person. So and in these types of scenarios, sometimes it's there. If you're fortunate enough where you're in an estate where there's just lots of assets, it's not as big of a problem, because then there is the potential where there's plenty to go around, so to speak. There's enough there to cater for the adult children from the prior relationship, whilst not taking away too much from your surviving spouse who might have, young minor children to also cater for. So there's in those circumstances, it's easier to advise clients on, because there's enough assets there to go around, although some people might not think that that's enough. But in any moving on from that, if generally when it gets hard though is when the estate is smaller and the will maker does actually have to pick in terms of, pick and prioritise. And generally what I would see in this context is that the priority would be to your surviving spouse, so the spouse that you're currently in the relationship with. And obviously, if there's younger children as a result of the second relationship or the second marriage, they tend to be the priority. And then you might, this is an area where a lot of the litigation is arising, where it's the stepmother or the spouse from the second relationship on one side who's the main beneficiary under a will, and the adult children from the prior relationship. This is an area which is being really geared up for, and it's fruitful for litigation, as you can see why in this context. From our point of view, it's really about the client coming in. They have to really lay it all out there in terms of disclosing the circumstances, and we try to work through it in terms of how to best cater for everybody's interest as much as possible to try to minimise the opportunities that a claim would be made following your death. The third element that I've raised there in the slides that also does complicate wills and estate planning is if a lot of the wealth is actually tied up in a family business. It's not actually personally held, so it could be in a trust structure, it could be a company, and they're the entities that you actually run your family business through. It gets even more complicated if you have two children and only one of them, say the son is the one that's actually been helping you with the business, works in the business, and the daughter or the other child doesn't work in the business. And most people, I would say, come in and say, if I've got two children, I want to treat them equally, with the view in mind that they want my disputes down the track. But then in other instances I've seen, the parents will come in and say they actually want to reward the son because he's the one that has been working in the business and he should be somewhat compensated as a result of that. So there's no right or wrong in terms of when a person comes in to see you and they point out clearly to you, these are my objectives and this is how I feel. Our job is really to navigate that through them and tell them possible strategies of how this can be done in order to minimise disputes down the track. And it would go back to my point again, if possible, to bring the children in on the conversation and the discussion early as part of the estate planning process, because it just, if nothing else, it minimises the chance that when somebody's passed away and there's been a shock at the will reading, or somebody's really disgruntled because they other than the grief of one of the parents passing away, they've then, they're met with this will that this is not what they expected, or they were thought that they were going to get more. So being able to take away some of that, it almost, even if it's not what they would have liked, it softens the impact, is what I'm trying to say, if they could have been brought in earlier to the conversation. And I understand that sometimes that's not always possible because of the family dynamics. So that's what I'll end on on that topic. But you'll see though, for on one of my last slides, that doing a will and is not. I mean, we like to start off by making it as simple as possible because there's real merits in that. It's understandable for the will maker and it's understandable for the beneficiaries that are going through it and reading it. But like I said to you, people's circumstances and their families and also the wealth that people have now has, exponentially increased over the last few decades. So this area is very fruitful for disputes that occur. And whilst our job is to try to minimise that as much as possible, it's really a matter of taking the first step to see a lawyer about it. You really need to lay all your, all the skeletons in the closet generally have to come out in the first meeting. They tell me all, and then our job is basically to craft the best estate plan for their specific children or beneficiaries that they're trying to cater for, whilst also giving them advice about the problems that can avoid. Now, we've all seen it. I've just pointed out some recent cases of deceased famous people where their estate or their will has been litigated because not everybody in the family or the extended family is happy about it. They're just obviously some of the cases. There's, it's just I didn't need to put those two names up there, but any day, any week now on the Sydney Morning Herald or news.com, there's various cases or stories about people's wills being disputed. So as you know, the first one I've got up there is about Bart Cummings, the famous horse trainer. He passed away. Not everybody in his family was happy with the contents of his will. Similarly with Bob Hawke as well, and that's a perfect example of a blended family. Blanche, his second wife, inherited most of the estate, and there was a dispute that arose from an adult daughter from Bob's first marriage who contested the will on the basis that she got left $750,000 and she felt that wasn't enough. So the laws, whilst the will maker can do a will and it's very clear in the will what their intentions are, there's a whole other flip side of it where there are people potentially that can make a claim against your estate on the basis that they've been inadequately provided for. So our job as professional advisors is really, once again, is about trying to get you into the door early, have a conversation early with you about what your objectives are, and to try to maintain, wherever possible, harmony within your family following your passing away, because at the end of the day, it makes sense. If you're happy during your life, you have good relationships with your children or your other extended family during your lifetime, it's important that for you, I would think, that as a legacy that you leave your family is also a happy one. And that concludes my end of the presentation.
Well, that's great. Thank you very much, Mimi. Certainly in my experience as a solicitor, and certainly in yours as well, many clients come to us with a view that their particular problems are so extreme or unique that it is difficult for us to be able to fashion a solution for them. But that's where it's really important to get advice from experienced legal practitioners. There's a very good chance that we have seen a similar situation before, and it's also nearly always the case that there are existing legal principles or certainly documents that can be called upon that will alleviate those problems. But the other thing we pride ourselves on is reducing this down to its most basic element, which is relationships between human beings. We like to say that the earlier you can come in, as you've just said, Mimi, the more likely it is that we will be able to fashion a solution that, very importantly, ensures a trouble-free, I should say, transition through that probate period, so that beneficiaries know what is on the horizon, the legal problems, and there are always legal problems, are ironed out before the only solution is litigation, which is obviously a bad result for everyone. We might take a few questions now, and I had one first of all for Gary. Gary, I understand from what you've said that the Silverliners and the free-range families constitute about 14% in total of the Australian population. Many of the qualities that you've ascribed to those categories, Silverliners in particular, would seem to be aspirational. People would want to become a Silverliner. If I'm not a Silverliner right now, will I ever become one?
Well, I'd be surprised that you're not already. I mean, you strike me as somebody that's already very positive. And look, the fact of the matter is we change as we age, sometimes for the better and sometimes not. There's no reason why for many of those characteristics we saw with the Silverliners that they're not things that you can choose to adopt. Things like discipline in life, things like taking the trouble to plan, things like taking responsibility for yourself and your family, they're decisions people make. And if people believe in the importance of those decisions, there's absolutely no reason why you couldn't be a Silverliner as well.
Fantastic, thank you. And one's come in from Peter for you, Mimi. I can see from your presentation that there can be complications with a will. At what point does the complication warrant the use of a lawyer to help me? Or should I consult a lawyer even if I believe my will and my circumstances are all pretty straightforward and uncomplicated?
Yep. So it's hard to tell because a lot of people think that their circumstances are simple, but often I've had a lot of meetings where they come in and they think it's simple, and then they start talking to me and I realise there's other issues. Like, for instance, superannuation is a big issue. It's more assets are in there, and people think that that's part of the will, where automatically part of the will, where that's actually not the case. So unless you've had the initial meeting, and it's worthwhile just having an initial consultation, even if you have an existing will, because wills should be reviewed every, say, 4 or 5 years, because your circumstances can change, just to get that review meeting. And if the will doesn't need to be updated, then that's fine as well, because that's peace of mind to know that you've done it. But more often than not, I will find that if somebody does come in, I've been able to tell them something that they hadn't thought of, because it's not their area, obviously, to know it. And we'd have a discussion about what we can actually do to resolve the issue now for you. Either is it an amendment to your will or another document that we might do for you, and it's all with the view and aim that we want to minimise the stress on your family when you pass away, minimise any chance for disputes down the track.
Thank you, and I might just pick on you again if that's okay, because we've had a great question from Brent. Brent asks, Mimi, you referred to the importance of having estate planning conversations sooner rather than later, whenever possible. Can you comment on how the older generation broaches the subject with the younger generation to ensure everyone's on the same page?
Well, the thing with that one is that's quite funny, because sometimes I've had the flip side of that, where it's the children that are actually in the parents' ear to say, Mum, Dad, you really need to get this sorted out. And it's often in the context of a blended family as well, where the adult children from the first relationship are saying to the parents, you need to sort this out, because, you know, I don't want to be left with the whole mess. So there are instances where that happens as well, when it's actually the children that are trying to be proactive and spur the kids on. It is in the other instances, where the examples I mentioned, where the parents, the patriarch or the matriarch, have a view in mind of what they want to do, and say it's a vulnerable beneficiary, or it's in the context of a family business and it's a bit sensitive because they do want to favour the child that maybe perhaps works in the family, it is delicate. It's a delicate conversation to have, and a lot of the parents actually don't want to open that conversation now during their lifetime, because they want to minimise the fallout now whilst they're still alive. But that can, you know, it takes courage to do it if you're in that type of context, but you've got to do it, because although you might not be around anymore, if you've got a son and daughter, the last thing I would think as a parent you would want is that you don't want those two kids to be battling out in the courts because it's unclear what the parents wanted, or one of them's really upset because they're surprised by the contents of the will. So it can be hard conversations you have now, but what we were trying to achieve is minimising an explosion that happens down the track when you're no longer here.
Yeah, that's great, Minnie. Obviously, a lot of experience behind both of those answers. Gary, if I could just ask you this, I'm curious as to why men dominate the ranks of the Silverliners and women, conversely, dominate the ranks of the free-range families. Have you been able to think that through at all?
Yeah, look, I've had a lot of thought about that because I thought it was fascinating. It didn't surprise me so much that free-range families were more women. Women tend to be quite free when they think about their family. They're much, they're caring, they're sharing. They like to see people succeed. There's definitely an orientation. They're a little less likely to be the controller in the family relationship, and I think that's a big part of it. With the Silverliners thing, I think it's very much related to the time. Frankly, if you have a look at the experience over the last 12 months, you've had a lot of men with plenty of time on their hands. When we look at the work that goes on in the home outside the day job, the work that goes on in the home, you can treat that in two different ways. You can share that work with your spouse, or you can help the spouse. And there's a big difference between those two things. So, say when it comes to cooking, I've got a lot of men that'll say, "Yeah, I'm the one that does the cooking in the household," and you probe a little further, and they say, "Well, that includes barbecue and toast." And I think what you're finding is that the distribution of labour in the household is oriented towards men having more free time and therefore feeling a little bit more positive. I'm going to do a fair bit more work on that because I think it's a fascinating phenomena, but certainly that distribution of labour in the household is not equal.
Yes, well, I'm shifting uncomfortably in my seat as we heard that from Gary. In fact, I might have to check my house for microphones and cameras put there by Perpetual. I've got one more question for you, Mimi, from Peter. Peter has asked a question about superannuation and non-estate assets, so things that don't typically form part of the deceased estate subject to a will. He asked what role a financial planner has to play as part of the team that's servicing a client.
Yep, so there are a lot of assets that don't form automatically part of your will, part of your estate to be governed by what you say in the will. So for instance, assets in a family trust don't fall within that category. Assets you held jointly with somebody else, if you die first, won't form part of your estate. And then in that category also of non-estate assets is superannuation because it has its own rules. So when you pass away, your superannuation death benefit doesn't automatically form part of your deceased estate. So the trustee of your super fund can have no total disregard to what you say in your will about how you want your superannuation to be distributed. We do work with financial advisors very closely in this space because superannuation rules are always changing. Recently we had that 1.6 mil cap being introduced as well. So we work with how we usually work with financial planners in the deceased estate space is how do we structure that death benefit in generally the most tax effective way following their death, and that's when we'd get the financial advisor or the taxation advisor's input there in terms of how it can be best structured in the most tax effective way. So that's generally how we work closely with them in that regard.
Great. And I think a really good final question, this one again directed towards you, Mimi. What would you say to people who take the view, there's plenty of time to prepare a will further down the track, or words to that effect? I hear that a lot, and I'm sure you would too. Yeah.
So you'll see that the statistics aren't great in terms of people in Australia, adults that have actually gone to do a will. People like to put it off, and we actually, in my area, we saw a spike in will inquiries and people wanting to renew and update their will once the terrible last summer where we had the terrible bushfires. We also tend to get a peak during Christmas time, not so much this year, but in past Christmas times when people are going overseas and they're about to get on a plane and the sense of mortality then hits them. So but otherwise, most of the general population do think I can pull it off because I'm not going to die anytime soon. That, we're all, in this area, we're all just about planning. It's great if you do a will and you don't need to touch it, and in 20, 30 years, 40 years even, it doesn't need to be updated and nothing happens with it because you're still living and you're healthy. But in this area, we're all just about planning for it could happen, and it's better that you just take the first step of doing it, just like a general, an annual checkup with the doctor, or your 6 monthly checkup with the dentist, really, just to get it done. And stash it away in the cupboard somewhere. It doesn't take too long to do. I mean, the process for most people, if it's non-complicated, is not a difficult process. It can be relatively straightforward. You've gotten it done, and then that's just an extra thing that you don't need to keep you up awake at night to think about.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Mimi, and thank you, Gary. Gary, I think the thing I drew most from that fascinating presentation was a sense that Perpetual is really thinking out of the box when they come to how they respond to their clients as individuals. So it's really heartening for me to see an organisation involved in that industry really breaking this down into its human elements. So I'm very grateful you're able to share that with us today. And Mimi, of course, the issue largely with wills is that you are traversing some fairly unpleasant topics, our own mortality, death and taxes, all that sort of stuff. And I'm really grateful that you were able to present in some fairly clear fashion some of the problems, not with a view to solving them all today, of course, but at least to, I hope, reassure people that these are problems that come up with all sorts of people, Silverliners, free-range families, and the rest of us. They're not unsolvable, but I think the key takeaway is to act early, pull the Band-Aid off, as they say. Don't wait for some other time down the track that's better, because chances are that won't exist. So thank you very much to both of you for that. That concludes the webinar for today. I'm sure I speak for both of my presenters, though, when I say if there are any further questions arising from any of this, by all means, please get in contact with Perpetual or Folbigg Lawyers. But for now, that's all from us. Thank you.